Okay, so now what we're going to do is find the angles when we're using the cosine law. So to find the angle measurement when given all three sides of a triangle, we use the cosine law. But we have to be careful in our setup. Remember that the side opposite the angle that we're looking for is our quote-unquote A. So that will be on the left side of the equation. We then have to isolate for the cosine of A by doing SAM/DEB, and then finally take the inverse cosine. Alright, so if we're looking at this triangle with a side across from C at 10, a side across from A at 16, and a side across from B at 18, we want to be able to figure out, well, what would be our three setups? If we want to solve for C, the left side of the equation would have 10. So we'd have 10 squared equals our other two sides. If we want to solve for B, 18 squared would be on the left side of the equation. And finally, when we're solving for A, our 16 is on the left side of the equation. So if we look at this question worked out, solving for A, we can see that we set it up with 16 on the left side, and our other two side lengths go in for B and for C. So we can simplify our squares. 16 squared is 256, 10 squared is 100, and 18 squared is 324. The product of 2 times 10 times 18 is 360, so we have minus 360 times the cosine of A. Now we want to isolate for the cosine of A, so therefore we need to move addition and subtraction first. So since we're adding the squares, we need to move those to the other side, so we subtract them from both sides. We're then left with negative 360 times the cosine of A. So once we've simplified the left side, we need to divide by negative 360. So that will isolate the cosine of A equal to a decimal. We then have to undo taking the cosine, which remember is an operation, so we take the inverse cosine of our decimal and we get an angle measurement of 62 degrees. Okay, so what I want you to do, go ahead and solve for B by doing the same setup. Okay, now remember, once you have angle A across from 16, you could solve using the sine law, but I want to check how you're doing by using the cosine law to solve for B. So come back to the video when you're ready. So checking your setup, you should have 18 squared, because that's the side across from our B. So notice the left side is our side B, and on the right side we're solving for B. Our other two sides, 10 and 16, go in for the other values. We can simplify them if we want to, but we need to isolate cosine B. So we subtract the 100 from both sides and we subtract the 256 from both sides. So we're left with negative 32 is equal to minus 320 times the cosine of B. Divide by that coefficient, so we're left with 0.1 is equal to the cosine of B, and take the inverse cosine of the 0.1 to get 84 degrees. Now that you have your angles A and B, you can simply subtract them from your value and you can solve for your missing angle. So this gives us 144. So we have a missing angle of 36. Okay, now again, once you've solved for one of your angles, you could use sine law to find your second angle and then subtract. Now I'm going to be checking your methods because depending on which angle you choose to solve for first, A, B, or C, you may vary slightly with your angle measurement. So I'll always be checking your work even if you don't get the same angles if you're off by 1 or 2 degrees. Okay, so what I want you to do now, I want you to go ahead and solve this triangle. So find all the unknowns. So we need to find all three angles, angle D, angle E, and angle F. So go ahead, work through this question. I'm going to start with angle D and then I'll continue on. But you can start with either, and again, we may find that you are off slightly and that's all because of the rounding. But pause the video, work through solving for the three angles, and then come back and solve and watch the video. Okay, so notice I solved for angle D first. So I set it up that 4.9 was on the left side of the equation, and I isolated for D. Okay, So I subtracted the 36 and the 38.44 from both sides, and then divided by the negative 74.4, and then took for the inverse cosine to get d was 47 degrees. Knowing that, I could then use the sine law, so sine of 47 over my 4.9, and I could solve for either e or f. I chose to solve for e. So I multiply both sides by 6 to isolate the sine of e, and then I took the inverse sine, which gave me 63.57, which I've rounded up to 64 degrees. So finally, my third angle will be the sum of those two angles subtracted from 180, which gives me a measurement of 69. So again, depending on which angle you found first, you may vary by 1 or 2 degrees, especially because of this rounding right here. Okay, so you're going to do some practice problems. Okay, I'd like you to do page 418, do question 1, and then we'll work on other questions where you have to solve for all the unknowns in class.